Your stories don't define you, but how you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and Chief Storymaker of Elkins Consulting. We share stories for so many reasons, to persuade, to entertain, and to connect. But what we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're perceived by the people you're interacting with. In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you. You'll nod your head in understanding, and then we'll dig into the lessons from each of those situations. When I'm working with clients on communication skills, I remind them to listen for understanding, not to respond. But during this podcast, I'm asking you to listen to consider your own related stories. I'm asking you to listen and consider which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. Today, I have the opportunity to speak with Marietta Gentles Crawford. Here I am getting an opportunity to visit with my friend Marietta Gentles Crawford. And I am so excited about this conversation because our theme is, it's so complementary to so much of what I already do. So Marietta is the author of From 9 to Thrive, a book about personal branding with great strategies for figuring out what your brand should be and how to strategically implement that through your activities and your behaviors. And I just love the book. So you can read all about Marietta and see the link to her books. You can purchase it or look at her profile and get to know her a little bit better in the associated blog post with this podcast. So because it's so easy to find out more about you, I would rather ask you a question that people might not get access to in your LinkedIn profile or in a bio or even in your book. So can you think of something about you that people might not know?
Oh, that's a good question, Sarah. And first of all, it's a pleasure to be here, just chatting with you. And here's something that actually may surprise you as well. It's something that we have in common. And it's the fact that when I was younger, I had a little short-lived singing career.
Oh.
I used to sing. I had my childhood best friend and I had a group called M&M. It was Marietta and Melody, and we were M&M. And I sang in the choir. And in high school, I used to do talent shows. And it pretty much came to a really, really eventful halt. One of the talent shows where there was a huge issue with the mic. The feedback was horrible. I was performing, the curtains went down, and I was just so traumatized that I think I did one performance afterwards at the next talent show just to redeem myself, and since then, I only sing in the bathroom. So this is something that I don't share with anyone.
I can't believe that was it. And you never did it again.
Never did it again. I mean, when I say just traumatized, it was a traumatizing experience, honestly.
Oh my gosh. That's so sad and so funny at the same time.
It's hilarious. I mean, the feedback was one thing, but I don't know why the curtains went down, but it just went down on us, and it was just embarrassing. It's like the worst thing that could happen, when you're like 17
in high school.
Or so. Yeah.
Right. Well, I am hoping that in the next 5 to 10 years, you choose to get back into it. And maybe in the next year or so, we'll have a conversation about why you're going to choose to start singing again.
Oh my goodness.
But I'm going to wait for a year because I have an idea about that.
Oh boy, my heart, just for the record, my heart is beating very, very fast just listening to this.
Well, my husband and my best friend have told me that my superpower is getting people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. and usually for a good reason. Okay. It usually works out quite well, but
well, you're such a good storyteller. I'm sure that, we'd probably be in like such a natural conversation, and somehow we're singing it together, and I didn't realize that.
That sounds like a dream, doesn't it?
So that's my experience.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. We're going to have to dig into that later on in terms of how that impacted you and the story you tell yourself because of that experience.
Oh,
but again,
goodness.
That's going to be a year down the line when you've recovered.
Okay. I'll be prepared.
It sounds like you still haven't recovered from that incident in high school.
Heart still beating, Sarah.
So the reason I wanted to talk to you today is because we've had these great conversations about how something that happens at work can negatively impact your brand based on how you respond to it, or it can positively impact your brand depending on how you respond to it. And I know that this story was in your book, so if people want to read it, they'll get this story, but I think it's different to hear you tell the story. Mm-hmm. So tell me about this experience about being at work and having kind of a breakdown.
Yeah, I call it my nuclear breakdown, actually. So in my book, I talk about this time when I was a trainer. And I used to do call center training. And the trainings were literally from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, every single day for 4 weeks. So every day I'm, in the classroom, giving it my all, having activities. I'm on the train thinking about, is this quiet person in the back getting it? And, are they going to pass their assessments and everything like that? So it's something that I enjoy doing, but something that definitely took a lot of energy. So towards the end of the training, once all of my students graduated, then they went out to the call center floor, and I was like the supervisor, the acting supervisor. So at that point, I was a part of a team of maybe 5 other trainers. And one particular day, I was outside. It's pretty much like a very open space in the call center, and my team was in like a little bullpen that you can literally see them from across the room. And I remember just being so tired, Sarah. And, I'm helping people, I'm still kind of coming off this high from training 9 to 5 and, really being in the classroom. And now we're out on the floor. We're taking real calls. We're handling real life situations. And I just found myself one day as I'm working with my newly graduated call center reps. I looked over to my group at the bullpen where they are, and I'm going to tell you what it felt like in my head. In my head, I thought it was like the slow motion of them having the time of, it's kind of like when you watch a sitcom and they're doing like those replays and it happens completely in a different way that it wasn't in real life. So my full disclosure is that, maybe it wasn't as bad, but in my mind, I felt like they were just having such a great time. And here I am working so hard, doing my best, out there on the floor, so tired, like I just wanted a break. And in a moment of just, I don't know, I guess that replay that was in my head of them in slow motion, just having the time of their lives without me, I went over to that bullpen where they were, and I pretty much just kind of...
These are the other trainers, right?
These are the other, my colleagues at that, my colleagues. And I went over to them and I pretty much just started to vent. And I just kind of talked about, here it is. Literally one of my colleagues was there. He was reading the newspaper. Like he was, I still remember this to this day. He was sitting cross-legged in front of his computer and he's reading the newspaper. And I'm like, here it is. I am working so hard and I was underpaid and, I just kind of let it all out. And at that moment, it was just like, I'm sure the world, I felt like just kind of stopped. And everyone was just like, whoa, even for myself, I didn't even realize. Sometimes it's like, I don't want to say it was an outer body experience, but, it's one moment I'm thinking, look at them having all this fun while I'm working so hard. And in the next moment, I'm literally in front of them having this breakdown. And from there, I grabbed my bags, I grabbed my stuff, and I left for the day. And I realized that, oh my goodness, this was not good. This was not good. This was not good. Yeah. Probably wasn't the best way. And what reinforced that, so right after that, I took a couple of days off, and I finally got that time to just do what I probably should have done before. And my manager called me into her office and obviously spoke to me about my behavior, which is still in my being attached to it at that time. I thought, here it is, I'm your hardest worker. I'm here doing so much, and I'm here, just trying to make the best as a good reflection for our team, and I'm getting in trouble. I didn't make that connection at that time, how it affected my brand.
Wow. First of all, I have to ask you, did you get into trouble, like real trouble, or was it just she said you need to lay off and get yourself together? I mean, what
Yeah,
was her response?
yeah, that's a good question. I didn't get in trouble per se in that sense where I was, written up or anything, but she definitely had, and I remember her as someone who was very quiet and, just, I'm sure it was probably hard for her to even, you know, have to have this conversation with me because
Right.
she knew that I was her hardest, one of her hardest trainers. But as a manager, obviously, she couldn't let that type of behavior
Right.
go unaddressed. So, I mean, I think she acknowledged that, I was working really hard, but the way that I approached the situation was not professional.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So what about your coworkers? How long did you last after that in that job?
Believe it or not, I probably lasted about a year after that.
Wow.
It
And
was,
what was your relationship with your coworkers, the other trainers?
we were like family, and I think that's what made it hard, except for the one who was reading the newspaper. We weren't that close. But we had a good relationship, so it was difficult in the sense that I think for them, they knew that I'm a very passionate person. They knew that my heart was always in the right place. But then it's also like, hey, we didn't deserve that. And if you needed, the key that came out of it, and that was my lesson too, was if you needed help, ask for help. Why didn't you say anything? And,
Use your
I was here.
words.
And I was trying to be superwoman, and I realized that, and me trying to be superwoman, because when I did take those 2 days off, I came back and the world didn't stop,
Right.
like it didn't stop with me out of the office, so one of my other colleagues, they took over doing what I had to do. Everything went well. Like I didn't have to be that superwoman that I thought that I had to be.
And sometimes it takes that kind of breakdown to realize that while you provide great value, the world isn't going to stop if something happens.
Yeah.
So
And
did
yeah.
any of the call center employees hear this explosion?
No, thankfully not.
Good.
Thankfully,
Good.
it was within the team. Thankfully, but it also made me think about, just from a branding perspective, and from there, from then, I always cared about my reputation. Maybe I wasn't calling it branding or personal branding at that
Right.
time in my career. It was earlier on in my career. But from a reputation standpoint, it also made me realize that, no matter how good you are, all it takes is one event that can turn someone's opinion against you, even though, 90% of the time you do what's right, or people who know your heart, can say, oh, she's a great worker, she's a hard worker. But all it takes is just one event that can completely change someone's opinion and harm your brand.
Right. And that actually brings me right back to a couple of the details about that story. If that had happened anywhere else where you didn't have a familial type relationship with your colleagues, that would have done permanent damage. And so every time something like this happens, when we learn these lessons, we can look back and say, thank goodness it happened then and not somewhere else.
Yeah.
Because you learned so much, and it could have been so different if you had that breakdown in front of people who didn't care about you.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And it does. It only takes once. And it's so hard to come back after that, after you've done something. And it reminds me of something that happened when I was at a job where I was being treated really badly by my boss. And it was such a hard job because it was out of my comfort zone to begin with. And then on top of that, I didn't have the support that I needed. So my confidence just took a dive. And what I found was that I was getting so angry and so hurt by the treatment that I would go and talk about it to somebody else in the office. So I was dumping at work. I would, and even though people knew her and knew basically they had similar experiences, so it was, it's not like it was being received by somebody who didn't believe me,
Right.
But at the same time, if you're speaking badly about somebody in your office, what's to say that you're not doing that about the person you're talking to somebody else?
Right. Yeah.
So reputation factor right there is, well, this person is bad-mouthing somebody in the office, and how do I trust them that they're not doing it to me too?
Right.
That's a big one for me. And that was one of those lessons that I continue to hammer into my head, because even saying something good about a colleague can sometimes be perceived as talking behind their back.
Right.
So you have to be really careful and make sure that if you're saying something even positive about somebody to somebody else, that you've already said that to the person directly.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that there's no doubt about where it came from.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
It's
that's
so
intense.
true. It is. And you know what it is? And I think one of my lessons that I learned that it took time to really get it is the importance of being strategic. And, really managing your emotions, because even like for your example, you're saying like, okay, so if you're saying something negative, it can be held against you, right? And then if you say something positive, that can also be seen in a negative way. That's the same thing in just the, your actions in anything that you do. If you're not thinking about the consequences or how people are receiving it, it really can vary in the eye of the beholder. It really can. Yeah.
It comes right back to the word that I use all the time. In every training I give, every coaching client hears this word a million times in our conversations: intention.
Yes. Yep.
If you are intentional about what you're putting out there, it's a lot less likely to be misunderstood.
Right. It's so true. Yeah.
Wow. So tell me, I'm sure you have another story you can share about that temptation to melt down like that, but where you had some application of the lessons that you learned from that first meltdown.
Yeah, I mean, I think, just moving on to even within my career in different roles as a contractor, I've been fortunate enough to work in so many different industries and finance and the city and pharmaceutical and retail. And then, in different roles as not only as an entrepreneur, but as an intrapreneur, as a consultant. And, I've had a big project. One of the projects was for a big system rollout and as a consultant. And with every rollout that is high profile and, of course, a lot of money attached to it, there's a lot of people that have opinions. And, I was in a situation where a lot of pressure was being put on me to deliver and to deliver on time. And what I learned, and this is just something that I realized over the years, is that my name is everything. No matter who I talk to, no matter whatever that role is, you always want, when someone says your name, that they're thinking about it in a positive way. And what I learned over the years is that it's so important to be adaptable, to be flexible. And not to say that, you're just a pushover and you're going to say, if someone says they need something yesterday, you're going to say, oh, sure, and then sleep in the office.
Right.
But I think what I've learned where, in those high stress times where the temptation is to say, you guys are crazy. This is not realistic. I'm one person. We're one team. You take that step back and you start posing questions from a way that removes the emotion. And I think that's one of the biggest things I've learned is in managing I guess, they would call it emotional intelligence, right? In the matter of just not talking about, I feel like you're giving me unrealistic timeline. It's okay. This is the timeline you're giving me. Based on what needs to be done, this may not all be possible. How can we prioritize it? What is most important to you? And what I think what really shifted my thinking and what helped me build my brand when I started realizing, oh my goodness, I cannot make these mistakes, is starting to remove that emotion. And instead of, going to that first feeling of saying, everyone is crazy, I know that I'm not crazy.
Which is what you did.
Exactly, right?
With your team in that first situation.
Yeah, it's like instead of going to that, which is innate sometimes, and I can't say that, I'm always perfect and not feeling that way. But what I've learned over time, which is almost like a muscle, I say it's like a muscle because you have to continue to exercise it.
Practice it,
and practice it. What I've learned is that, you know what, you don't always have to be Superwoman or Superman, right? So it's okay to say that you can't do it all, because it's more important to do it all right and do it with your good intention.
So that being said, one other question about back at the first story where you melted down in front of your colleagues.
Yes.
Did they change their behavior toward you afterward and start picking up the slack? Did you see a difference once you used your words even in that manner?
Yeah, they did. They did. I think it's also a lesson in communication too. And again, expressing it, obviously, in removing that emotion. If I had said it in a better way, like, hey, I feel like, you know, it's a honor to be seen as one of the top trainers, but with that honor comes a lot of work, and sometimes I need help, and I think that became a little bit more apparent and noted in the future.
So I guess where I'm going with this is that you had to have that experience for you. I mean, so that you would learn that whole resiliency, you know, and putting yourself, stepping back and putting yourself in a different mindset.
Right.
But at the same time, they had to learn that lesson as well.
Yes.
And I am not always sure that if you hadn't melted down the way you did, it's possible that your team wouldn't have taken it the way that they did. They may not have taken it as seriously if you'd approached it in a more strategic and less emotional way.
Right. So am I vindicated, Sarah? Thank you.
You are vindicated. Especially when they're young. If it's a young team. And I'm getting the impression this was a group of young people in their mid to late 20s.
Yes, around that time, yes.
So that's at a pivotal time in our development, our emotional intelligence development, that sometimes we have to hear it in a more emotional way to let it sink in.
Right.
And I think about that with my kids. As they've gotten older, as teenagers, if I don't put some emotion into my conversation with them, they dismiss it. So I think it's really a fine balance. I'm not suggesting that anyone go to their team and melt down about how hard they're working. But at the same time, sometimes adding a little emotion helps. And when I had another situation with a woman who was very difficult to work with, I went to her because I had to ask her a question, and I hated asking her questions because she was so mean. You know, she's mean to everyone, and people just avoided her office. And I was tired of stepping on eggshells, you know, tiptoeing around her. And I had to go ask her this question. So I walked in, and she was so angry with me about something else. And she is just livid. Her face is red. She's sitting down behind her desk, and I'm standing up in front of her desk. And she's just furious with me. And she says that to me. I'm so furious with you. I'm just angry with you. And she said, I felt like you went around me, and I don't know why you didn't ask me this question. And I said, well, I asked my boss, and he said that this, you know, he gave me the answer. And she said, well, he doesn't know. And I just looked at her and I smiled and I said, well, if I have a choice between asking you a question and asking him a question, I'm going to ask him because you're not nice to me.
Oh.
You're dismissive. You're rude to me when I walk into your office. Why would I intentionally come to you when I have another option? And her face just dropped. It was that reality. And it wasn't, and again, I was taking the emotion out of it from me. I wasn't saying you're mean to me and you're a mean person. That's not what I was saying to her. I was saying, you're not very nice to me.
Right.
And it's amazing how quickly the dynamic changed in the room when I used those words.
Yeah.
But it took me how many years of dealing with that kind of behavior before I learned to speak up and use those words and use the right words with the right person. And it's all part of that story. How do you learn that? Well, you have experiences like a complete and utter meltdown at work.
It's true. It really is, and it does make you stronger. And I mean, honestly, I can laugh about it now, and I'm glad I can laugh about it now. Like back then, it wasn't funny. Back then, it was just like, it was the horrible. But it's also good to just take accountability, because that's one of the lessons too I learned, which is important, especially when you think about your brand and reputation, and not only how you see yourself, but how other people see you, is to be accountable for your actions. And it's important not just to only look at what someone did wrong to you, but also say how you could have handled that situation better. Because if you miss that point, then you miss the lesson in these experiences.
Right. And then apologizing, making it right somehow after you've had the meltdown.
Yeah, after. Yeah. We'll need a little distance sometimes.
Exactly. So I'm just going to circle back here, because I want to remind you of your first story and how you gave up on singing because of that experience. And I just want to remind you that this can be applied. This is an application. You kind of had a meltdown on stage because the stage itself kind of melted down on you.
You literally,
and then you gave up. So I'm just going to remind you of that. I'm just going to put that out there and make you sing a duet with me sometime when we see each other.
Heart beating.
Marietta, thank you so much. This was a really valuable conversation. It reminded me of a lot of those situations that I experienced in my youth and my especially early professional career, where I had those kinds of emotional experiences, and how I've applied them and how I can practice continuing to apply them in terms of making sure that my reputation and personal brand is intact, and that I'm intentional about what I'm putting out there.
Absolutely. I couldn't say it any better. Absolutely.
That was great. Well, thank you so much. And again, Marietta Gentles Crawford, you can read about her on the blog post associated with this podcast, and reach out to her, connect with her on LinkedIn, and for goodness sake, buy her book. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.
Now listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that you're going away?